It is an honor to have Joyce Barnathan from the International Center for Journalism with us. Before she gets started with her remarks, I just realized in the information we sent out, I didn't provide any bio on who Joyce is other than president of the ICFJ, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of background that I grabbed and had verified. So just so that you realize that when she gives us her opinions and her views on something, she knows whereof she speaks. So, prior to coming to ICFJ, Joyce held a wide range of senior editorial and management positions at Businessweek and Newsweek. At Businessweek, she was executive editor of Global Franchise, where she played a role in expanding the magazine's reach and improving its editorial product from around the world. As assistant managing editor at Businessweek, she supervised almost every department of the magazine. As the Asia regional editor, she launched the Asia edition of Businessweek, managed award-winning coverage of China's growth, Asia's financial crisis, and turmoil in Indonesia. At Newsweek, she held a number of journalistic posts, including the Moscow bureau chief, special national political correspondent, and State Department correspondent. She's been honored with 5 overseas press club awards and 1 national headliner award, among other honors. And she served as the Freedom Forum Fellow, 1989 to 1990. She's covered, Chernobyl, handover of Hong Kong to China. I was Glasnost, an amazing range of stuff. That's what she's going to be telling you.
Just wait.
She has a bachelor's degree in Russian and Chinese area studies, as well as a master's in Asian studies from Washington University and a master's in journalism from University of Missouri. She speaks conversational Russian, Chinese, and Spanish. So with that background, I think I'm going to hand the microphone over and sit down and start listening. Thank you for coming, Joyce.
Thank you very much, Pablo. I just wanted to, I'm so delighted to be here today. My first trip to Google was in 2000, maybe before most of you were here. And I remember sitting down with Sergey and Larry, and both of them telling me that search was the killer app, and maybe everybody in the world hadn't figured that out, but they had figured that out, and just watch. And now I come back, and I'm impressed and bowled over, and we all know the Google story. I prepared a little speech that deals with some of the issues that I'm concerned with as a journalist or a former journalist and the head of a nonprofit that tries to promote quality journalism around the world. And I called it Global Digital Journalism, a Transformative Moment. And I'll give this speech, and then I welcome any comments or questions or any discussion you'd like to have. The digital journalism revolution has created a revolution in journalism across the planet. And certainly there's a global digital divide between the developed and the developing world. But even so, the internet is changing how news is delivered and covered in the developing world. Let me give you some examples. There are bloggers in Egypt who are posting videos of torture victims. There are Guatemalan community radio stations that are now starting to use the web to create a platform on which they can create a network and share content. There are citizen journalists in Mexico who are broadcasting crackdowns on protesters that would never have been covered before. So we see that this is an incredibly important moment, and access to information technology is really key for journalists in these countries. But what makes this moment truly transformative is not information alone, but the quality of the information, and this is a big theme of mine, the quality of the information. More than ever, the world needs journalism that's discerning, insightful, and fair. Journalism that reveals critical issues and stories that might otherwise go unnoticed and untold. For companies like Google, the future of global journalism is also, I'm sure, a very important issue. I visited, Google News repeatedly, and you've got skin in the game, as they say. The websites of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, BBC, and other top news organizations, as you know, are increasingly attracting numbers of visitors. But Google News likely has more visitors than any one of those sites. And if you ask me who the most powerful person is in the news media today, I could easily argue that it's not the New York Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger or the Washington Post publisher Donald Graham or even a person at all. It's an algorithm, your algorithm. So it sets the agenda for millions of readers each day all across the world. And this development raises some tough questions that I think all of us needs to address. How do we ensure quality and integrity in a fragmented digital landscape? How do we make sure that all stakeholders in news production and distribution uphold their responsibility for protecting the news? Now, the world's growing interconnectedness has sweeping consequences for journalism. We've seen the advent of larger and larger mass media organizations whose owners' primary business is not necessarily journalism. News cycles have shrunk from days to hours and even minutes, leaving journalists with even less time to make very difficult ethical decisions. Well, for us in the established news business, reputation is everything. We need our readers to trust and value the information we provide. In whatever platform the news is delivered, the web, newspapers, TV, cell phones, journalism ethics remains an integral part of what we do. Strong ethics and skills helps us earn credibility with readers and viewers. And also, strong ethics builds a reputation for credibility and reliability that spells greater opportunity for commercial success. Governments, both our own and those around the world, are less likely to impose standards on media if journalists hold themselves to high ethical principles. Today, a solid grounding in ethics is needed as never before. After all, we live in an age when news stories of global impact, as well as rumors and outright falsehoods, race across the world at the click of a mouse, shaping public opinion for better or for worse. The consequences of ethical failure in an era of global economics, instantaneous communications, and systems of mass destruction are much more serious than in simpler times when damage from ethical failings was more likely to be isolated and contained. Think Danish cartoons. Media ethics, it's becoming clear, must emerge from the people who write and edit the news, from publishers and station owners, and from those who sell the advertising and subscriptions to sustain the news, and from those like Google who aggregate it. Effective and meaningful ethical standards can never be imposed from an external source. They must be an outgrowth of what all of us, with our various roles to play, do every day. Now, ICFJ, the International Center for Journalists, and I'll use the acronym, tries to assist journalists around the world in gaining the skills they need to do their job responsibly. We recognize that independent media are a prerequisite for free and civil societies. We work around the globe, in Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, often in countries where fragile, nascent democracies are confronting the burgeoning demands of global economics and newfound pluralism. Greater press freedom has allowed for more assertive, less defensive journalism, and greater consciousness of the need for standards to ensure quality and avoid abuse. During its history, ICFJ has worked with some 40,000 journalists from more than 170 countries to share practical hands-on skills in journalism and business media management. ICFJ helps these journalists provide their fellow citizens with the information that they need to take part in the social, economic, and political lives of their societies and to make smarter decisions that we hope will improve lives. Just to give you an example, we're conducting business journalism programs in China, health journalism training in Africa, environmental journalism training in Latin America and Asia. And just so that you know, we place an equal emphasis on training in business, the business side of the media, because editorial independence is impossible without financial independence. Now let me return to the impact of the internet. In the West, the rise of the internet has turned a highly developed media on its head. I'm sure you've had discussions with journalists these days, you know what I'm talking about. What happens when this transformative technology affects countries where an independent media is just beginning to develop? All of us need to be aware of the effect of the growth of information technology in such regions and what an absence of quality can mean. It can mean the difference between a free society and an unfree one, the difference between justice and injustice, the difference between an informed citizenry and one that is deceived by government propaganda. These differences are truly enormous. We all know what good standards are and what quality is in traditional newspaper journalism. But what are the best practices when it comes to citizen journalism and the blogosphere? There are trailblazers around the world. You all know of Oh My News in South Korea. But it behooves us to figure out what constitutes quality information in an effort to promote it in a fast-changing digital environment. At ICFJ, we're trying to help journalists navigate this new terrain. We're getting untold requests for help with digital training from around the world. It's just pouring in. Our flagship program, the Knight International Journalism Fellowships, sends global reporters to places around the world to work on high-impact projects, many of which have digital components. And these journalists go out there and do their work for a year at a time. In Guatemala, I mentioned it earlier, but in Guatemala, for example, our fellow is working with community radio stations, many of them run by indigenous people, to create a web platform where they can share programming with one another and also with Guatemalan immigrants in the United States. And we think this is going to help exponentially increase content and better inform these communities. On a much larger scale, we just signed an agreement with the University of Guadalajara to create the first digital journalism center in Latin America. This comes in response to unending requests from Latin American news organizations for deeper understanding of how to produce quality journalism on the web. This is going to be a year-long degree program, and it will also include modules for working journalists. The curriculum is really exciting. We're going to teach everything from digital investigative journalism to multimedia management. The university has invested quite a bit, and now I'm going to try to raise funds for the rest. And we're hoping to launch in September and recruit students not only from around the region, but also among Hispanics in the US, and this will be quite affordable. We're also aggressively expanding our website, and we have several websites, but I'm going to mention the International Journalists Network, or IJNet.org. It's the go-to site for international journalists to learn about training programs and networking opportunities. And we publish in 5 languages: English, Spanish, Portuguese, Arabic, and Persian. And we're hoping to add Russian, Chinese, and French. And our latest IJNet offering is an interactive guide on how to produce a quality blog for journalists in the developing world. We're also working with the Poynter Institute, a journalism training organization based in Miami, to develop interactive training modules in multiple languages with content customized for different cultures and regions. As you can imagine, there are journalists in some countries where you can't even send someone in to train or help. But you can do distance learning, and we're trying to provide those kind of resources so that when things do free up in these societies, the journalists have the skills they need to thrive. And the other thing is, at a time when U.S. newsrooms are cutting back on international bureaus and coverage, which is a huge concern of mine, we think we can provide a link for U.S. news providers to quality local journalists around the world. So we can link up U.S. news and Western news organizations with really good local journalists. ICFJ is not an advocacy group. Our goal is to provide valuable training, and we know how difficult it can be operating overseas. We're trying, for example, to engage the media in countries like China. This fall, we're launching what we consider to be a groundbreaking program in global business journalism at the prestigious Tsinghua University in Beijing. This is a 2-year master's degree program that we hope will create a cadre of top-notch Chinese business reporters and editors who can produce clear, balanced, insightful coverage of Chinese and global markets. And we really do believe this will help make the Chinese market much more transparent and foster greater understanding between China and the international business community. And given what's been in the news lately with Chinese exports, there's certainly a need for more watchdogs for the benefit of us all. I want to underscore that our colleagues overseas truly face hurdles that most of us here cannot imagine in their effort to tell the truth. Each year, ICFJ presents 3 awards to outstanding international journalists who inspire us simply by doing their job. Last year, we gave one of our awards to Drago Hedel of the Feral Tribune in Croatia, and he has done whatever he can to hold war criminals in the former Yugoslavia responsible for their deeds. Bagila Bukharbayeva, who was born in Uzbekistan and now works as a reporter for the AP, witnessed the massacre of Uzbeks by the government in the city of Andijan and exposed this to the rest of the world. And then there was this young woman journalist, Shada Al-Jabouri, head of the BBC's Arabic service. This woman is an Iraqi journalist who has to change the time that she leaves for work each day to avoid being kidnapped. When she reports from bombing sites, she cannot stay too long or she risks attracting the attention of insurgents. She has to keep a distance of 100 meters from U.S. troops who might otherwise shoot. She lives in an apartment that has at best 4 hours of electricity each day, so she prefers to stay in the office. And she tells no one, except her very closest friends and family, what she does for a living. This year's winner includes our first citizen journalist. His name is Wael Abbas, and he's an Egyptian blogger who has dared to write about prisoner abuse, crackdowns against protesters, and other subjects that the established local media have generally avoided. But what's happened is, because he's done such a good job, he's gotten so much attention from Egyptian viewers and users of his blog that the traditional media are now forced to follow and cover the same stories. And when that happens, you start to get accountability. These journalists remind us that news is not a commodity, but a vital service that requires skill and, in many cases, unusual bravery simply to practice. I'm going to give a little plug here, but we have an annual dinner where we honor this year's winners, and it would be so wonderful if Google representatives could attend. It's on November 13th. I have some pamphlets here should anybody be interested. And it's really where we showcase what these international journalists do and the type of work that ICFJ does. We give one award to a U.S. journalist who we feel really stands for high-quality journalism, and this year it's going to go to NBC's Tom Brokaw. And our keynote speaker is ABC's news anchor Bob Woodruff, who you probably recall was gravely injured in Iraq. And every year our MC is George Stephanopoulos, and we're very grateful for him for that. Before I wrap up, I want to talk about another important concern of mine in the digital journalism world. And this may sound blatantly obvious, but we need editors more than ever. Customization of the news, I mean customization to one. Give me what I want, when I want it, is in many ways the glory of the web. But it can also be worrisome. It can keep journalists like Drago and Shada from reaching their potential audiences. As we know, editors and news producers painstakingly decide what stories will appear on the front page of a newspaper, on the cover of a magazine, or during the 30 minutes of a nightly newscast. On the web, readers with their RSS feeds often decide what they want to receive. The disintermediation of the editor, in other words, removing the editor and putting the news consumer in charge of the news received, has significant ramifications. Those key judgments that editors make suddenly disappear. And the danger is that readers or viewers miss news they didn't know they needed to know. When you customize to one, you often lose the serendipity of finding great discoveries that are important to you and your community, and the ability to set a common agenda is diminished. The web also allows users to reinforce their beliefs and shun competing analyses. You go to the blogger who believes the same things you do, and you get just what you're looking for. And there can be nothing wrong with that. I mean, we all read particular columnists or watch particular commentators because we like their slant on an issue. But many of us also watch columnists, we read columnists that we don't agree with just to learn the opposing view. And on the web, the danger is that customization to one means that we miss exposure to alternative thinkers, to the other side of a key issue. So while digital journalists in countries like Egypt are often bringing an alternative view to compliant, if not controlled media, we're a little bit concerned that in the US we're hearing what we want to hear and turning off other voices. So, is there a next generation of the web that instead of focusing on creating more niches, tries to bring us together? How can all of us involved in the news business get people out of their comfort zone and learn about the other side? How can we ensure that there are funds to produce the news that we and citizens across the globe need to exist as free, independent societies? I have yet to hear a financial model that I think is even viable for most big media news organizations that have vast bureau networks overseas. I still don't get how they're going to survive. And maybe you smart folks at Google can figure it out. And I ask you to work with us to try. I'm really a believer that people will search for quality news on the web and that users will continue to insist on credibility and integrity. In an era when anyone can say anything they want on the web, information from quality news sources will mean more than ever before. These days, when you ask someone where they saw a particular news story, they often respond, Google News. You may not have produced that story, but you are identified with it. Quality and integrity have always been core to Google, and that's why your search tools are so great. Your founders realized that search was the killer app, and if it were used as a sales tool, it would diminish its credibility. Based on that common desire for quality, there's lots of space for all of us in the 21st century news business to find ways to work together to ensure that quality, ethical journalism prevails. Thanks, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yes. Hi.
One way to proxy for the quality of an article might be to look at the reputation of the author, or the journalist who wrote it. And it seems like one of the things that you're doing is training these journalists. So what you could do is, I don't know whether you actually certify these journalists, but if you could provide us with some sort of signal or information about those journalists, then that's something that we could take into account in our algorithm, for instance. That would say, okay, in addition to just looking at the number of links that this article gets, we'll look at the reputation of this journalist and factor that into our ranking too. So is there an effort to, I mean, first of all, is there any information that you could provide us in that regard? And second, is there any effort to certify journalists as part of your training program?
Yeah, we don't tend to certify them, and we have talked about rating or ranking journalists, which is a little bit dicey because, you know, we're giving them the skills they need, but how they choose to go about using them is a different thing. IJNet has 20,000 journalists who log in every month to find out about networking opportunities. And one of the ideas that we were tossing around was a Facebook where they could post the type of stories that have been written for other publications, and you could see the type of work, you can go up there and see the type of work that they're doing. But whether we could, you know, what I wouldn't want to do is certify that somebody's taken the course, and that is necessarily a guarantee that you're always going to get quality journalism. We hope that's the case, and we hope that they have the skills. But I think it's a good idea, and it's worth thinking about.
So is there anything you can think of that you could tell us or that we could learn about journalists? I mean, we can create signals to figure this out ourselves, but coming from the journalism standpoint, what should we be looking at that could tell us how good a journalist is, or whether Or maybe it's just, what are the characteristics of content that
Well, we
make
could
it quality?
try, what we could think about is to think about how we could tap into, we've been around for 23 years, tap into the trainers and the fellows who have been out in the field and maybe get lists of journalists that they know are doing really quality work. And the other thing is, if they post who they write for, if international journalists write consistently for the AP, even on a freelance basis, it's almost a guarantee that they're reaching a certain level. And there might be, if we can get them to post stories on IJNet, there might be a way to do that as well. Yes. Okay. I'm just getting a pen. I can't be a journalist without a pen in my hand, so.
Kind of elucidating a little bit more on what you just said.
Yeah.
I've heard other journalists say that there's this pressure right now on the web for fracturing, and it's coming from a business standpoint as well. Freelance journalists, bloggers, and that's a very different thing from the New York Times with a newsroom and editors. And the point they make is that the newsroom and editors and that social environment actually tends to reinforce a certain set of ethics that is identifiable, and that freelance journalists to a lesser extent and individual bloggers to a greater extent have a tendency to fall into some traps, like going native, like being more beholden to their sources than they are to their audience, and other things like that. Do you think that, and you just said something about someone who's consistently publishing for the AP that's a good signal that they're maintaining a certain level of ethics and reliability. Do you think that, first off, there's some spot where this balance will naturally fall, where there's sort of a unit of journalism larger than an individual and smaller than the New York Times or the AP that is naturally viable and that can maintain that sense of integrity and viability?
Well, I think I think that's a really good question. And we had talked about doing some programs for bloggers here to get them together, talk about what are best practices, because they are on their own often. Sometimes they're obviously from the mass media and they've splintered off and they have the values. But when you work in a newsroom, there is I'm sure as you work in an organization like this, there are cultural values that do get passed on from generation to generation to generation. We've evolved to a pretty good state, despite all of our failings, a pretty good state of how to balance church-state issues. In other words, where the business side stops and editorial begins. We know how to separate those interests. We know how to think through tough issues in the newsroom. And what we found internationally is that a lot of the bloggers want the journalism training. They want you to get out there and give them the sense of what is right, what is wrong. And I will tell you that's even true in the ethnic media here. We did some programs for ethnic media and personal finance journalism. And there was huge amount of confusion about what is a conflict of interest. It wasn't defined at all. The conflicts were rife. So it's a pretty big issue. And I think that there is a role for training in that area. But I don't think you should underestimate how important that is, and how important it is to have those values, how important it is to check your facts, how important it is to get your name spelled right, and to make sure that things are in context, to make sure that, that you're not writing about a stock that you own and you're pumping it up as they used to do in China, that you're not paid to go to a press conference. I mean, it gets very basic. But so I think there's a lot to be learned, and as we do fragment, I think the need for that kind of training gets greater and greater. But as you see, like in Oh My News, they actually have editors who vet for content. I mean, even the new iterations that are coming up and being massively successful still have that role of somebody is serving as gatekeeper, somebody is serving as quality control officer, and I think that's really essential. Let me just add one thing before there's a new program about to take place at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, And this is a program, it's quite interesting. It's also funded by the Knight Foundation, but it's to teach all students at the university how to consume news, how to be a good news consumer. In other words, what is good journalism in this fragmented world? So some of the training may go to the consumers of news, and some of it needs to go to the newly formed journalists or citizen journalists.
So if you take a recent example, I saw this Bill Moore special on the lead up to the Iraq War and the information that was put about by, I guess, what might be called reputable news organizations in this country, you know, basically siding with Colin Powell's presentation at the UN and so on and so forth, which now everybody knows was a load of nonsense.
Right.
You know, everybody, the reputable news media were just, I mean, they went along and followed down a blind path, or I don't know what happened. They were completely,
Yeah.
I mean, nothing worked. All these good quality training ethics, it just, I don't know, it didn't work. What would
Yeah,
you
you
say to
know,
that?
it's not a perfect world. It's not a perfect world, and there are failings. I will tell you, as a journalist myself, listening to Colin Powell, this was a reputational thing too, and he had a reputation that he put on the line, and because he had the reputation that he had, I think it carried a certain amount of credibility. Whereas if it had been others, it would have been a lot more difficult, and that did help sway probably a lot of traditional media in the wrong direction. But I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that there were dissident voices even then. You could turn to Paul Krugman at the New York Times and see that he was against the war and writing a column on it. So it's, and is that an ethical failing or is that a judgmental failing? You know, an ethical failing I would put in a different category.
Isn't there something to be said for the multiple sources on the internet that you can still fish around and get the multiple to save us from this type of?
Absolutely.
You know, they're not maybe trained journalists, but somebody with another view or something really strong to say that makes you think, oh, that makes sense. How these people are addressing it.
I think multiple voices are great. What I'm calling for are quality multiple voices. In other words, is that picture that you just sent in as a digital journalist real? Is it reliable? That story that you saw in the New York Times was probably the best judgment of that group of editors and writers at that time. Is this a best judgment? Are you in the pocket of somebody? Is somebody paying you to write this? Multiple voices are great. Yes, and you want them, and it's a wonder. I'm just sounding some cautionary notes here, but I love the fact that people are weighing in, and I see as a journalist multiple ways. You can you used to have a Rolodex of sources, and those are valuable sources, but now I can see ways of exponentially increasing my sources through digital technology. I can see new networks forming. I can see all sorts of great things happening. I'm not trying to diminish that. I'm just making a call for quality. And how do you know it's quality?
Hi.
Yes.
Peter
Oh,
Wehner.
sorry. Where are you? Oh, I'm sorry.
Peter Wehner spoke at Google last year, and he made a point that
Who did, sorry?
Peter Wehner, he's a New York Times writer and author, and he was talking about, okay, his topic was why you need to pay for reporting and the internet isn't sufficient. And one of his claims was that bloggers aren't reporters. They echo reporting and add commentary. And by contrast, you're grouping bloggers together with reporters. Can you comment on that?
Well, bloggers can be reporters, and bloggers can also just be mouthpieces. I would say that this Egyptian reporter that we're honoring, or blogger that we're honoring, is a journalist, is what I would call a citizen journalist. I think, when I think of myself, somebody said to me, you should blog every day on your site because that will help increase your visibility and blah, blah, blah. And I can go on there and off the top of my head, spin something on a daily basis. I don't think that's quality, you know? I just don't think that's quality. Maybe you think it, maybe other people will think it's quality. I really want to go out and do a little bit of original reporting, original thinking, and I think the best bloggers are people who are experts in their field, who bring something to the table every day that you want to check out. They've got a great idea, they've got a great insight, they've got a great product, whatever it is. I think those are the bloggers that, or have a voice that resonates with you, but the voice has to be intelligent in some way or another. And so I think that, you know, to me, the difference between a blogger and a columnist, I mean, they can almost be the same. You might read a person on the op-ed page because you think they just have a great perspective. But usually those pieces are reported. And I would say the best blogs bring something new. If they just sit there and tell you the same old stuff every day, you're not going to go return and read it. Am I wrong?
No, you're correct, but op-ed is comparable to bloggers, and most bloggers aren't going at your Egyptian example is an exception, but most bloggers aren't going out there and getting news stories themselves. They're looking at other news stories and bringing them to your attention.
Right. Well, that's a different type of blogging. They could be aggregators in a funny way, and spinning out the news. But I think the bloggers that I know that I return to on a daily basis or on a frequent basis are people who I think bring something special to the table.
The trouble is, blogging is just a medium, and people use it for different things. So I think you're having almost
Right.
a vocabulary disagreement.
Right. Well, there are bloggers who are journalists or who want to communicate, and I think that's right. Their blogger is a very, very, very big term. Yeah, go ahead.
In your talk, you mentioned ethics and used as example the publication of some cartoons that led to riots and injuries of a handful of people. And it sounds like in your response to this question a few minutes ago, you did not categorize the U.S. coverage anyway of weapons of mass destruction and things like that as an ethical failure, even though it led to war and the death of 1 million Iraqi citizens and things like that. I mean, that seems to me like it's a huge example of an ethical failure, and that's something we should be paying a tremendous amount of attention to.
Okay, the thing is the ethics that we have to rely on the information that we have access to. And we have to rely, the information. I mean, I don't know when you found out about when there was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but I found out only after the troops went in and there were no weapons there. I don't know what. Again, I just don't know if this was a judgment call, or there were journalists that were writing op-ed pieces that this was not a good idea, and there were journalists that were writing pieces that it was a good idea. But the information that we had to work with was somewhat limited. And you had somebody as credible as Colin Powell going out there at the UN stating that they were there. Now, I'm not trying to defend this because obviously it makes me, heartbroken to think about what's happened. But I'm not sure that I put that in the category of I'm going to step over some line and put this information out for the sake of going to war, that I'm trying to promote the U.S. government policy because I believe this is the right policy and we need to go to war. I'm not sure that that was the slant of the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of them. I would bet that it's not.
I was wondering what you thought the fragmentation of traditional media onto online, how that will affect objectivity and bias in journalism, whether people will try to be objective or just go all out and show their biases.
The question was about objectivity and bias in a fragmented digital world, and whether you think people will go for more objectivity or more bias. I think you'll see both. I think you're going to see, extreme voices out there that will attract certain people because they want to hear that. And I also think that the ones who get many, many eyeballs will be the ones that make sure that their news is reliable and high quality, because that's what will make people return. And I think that people, the question is, how do you know? And is branded news worth anything? I mean, when I was looking at Google News this morning, I saw a lot of branded news sites there. I also saw some unusual ones that I didn't know about. And that doesn't mean that they're not good or not bad. They may have great reputations where they are. But the question is making sure that whoever the news source is, that you feel that this is a really reliable one, because people are coming to you for that kind of quality.
I'd like to kind of go back to the very first question. The guy asked what kind of signals could you give Google to help Google figure out the reputation of people. And I guess I want to say to you that the things you said made a lot of sense, and especially the issue of reputation today in journalism, certainly to me. And the second part of what I wanted to say is actually addressed more to the Googlers here than it is to you, but he was asking you, what could you do, in a way, what could you or anyone outside do for Google to help establish the concept of reputation? And it seems to me personally, not as a representative of Google, that search engines like Google could do a lot more to be sensitive to notions of reputation. Have you ever had a dialogue with people at Google about development of the notion of reputation in
Well, I just got here, so I think we're going to have that later today, maybe.
Because it seems to me that there's a good deal more that could be done, and it probably is something more for the people at Google to do to support the concept of reputation.
But what we can do is be a great link to many voices that could be wise counsel. Our board has stellar international journalists on it, the journalists that are called in every time there's a crisis to come try to figure out what went wrong on Jason Blair or whatever. The head of Bloomberg News, Lou Bacardi of the AP, who's a standard bearer of high ethics, Jim Hogue of the Council on Foreign Relations, who was formerly Daily News and Chicago publisher. We've got a lot of resources that we can help link up and bring to the table for very meaty and hearty discussions on reputation, and I'd be happy to do that.
Hey, just want to say thanks for coming. Really appreciate you being here. And I had to miss the first half. I had a meeting. I apologize. So if this is a duplicate question, I'm sorry. I have a blog myself, and I've been studying journalism, and I'd like to be closer to a journalist. And it turns out there's not a lot of resources that I can find. You'd think MIT or Berkeley or Stanford would have digitized their journalism courses. I've looked on iTunes University where people have gotten podcasts, and there's really not a lot in terms of resources that I've been able to find. So my selfish question would be along the lines of, if I'm a blogger and want to be closer to a journalist, what steps should I take? But the more general question, I guess, is what advice do you give to bloggers, who are looking for those resources, or how do we solve that problem of people who want to be closer to objective, decrease their bias,
right.
Not have those kinds of conflicts?
I think that you're an underserved market myself, and I think that we've been trying to think about how to do that, how to provide training for U.S. bloggers to cover international events. But you raise a very interesting proposition that is also something we can think about, if not for us, with another organization, which is a mentoring system. We've been talking a lot about how we can mentor, and it would be a fascinating thing to have, and I'm talking about mentoring in a more professional sense, where you have not just call somebody up on a whim, but you actually have the mentee, the person who needs the mentoring, setting the agenda, saying these are the things I need for each meeting, having monthly phone calls with a given journalist, and that's something that would be very interesting to think about. I do think that a lot of the institutes are trying to think about how to provide training. My struggle in my incarnation is How do I teach quality blogging, again, to journalists overseas? What are best practices? And I think the pedagogy is not yet there yet. But we will be getting there because there's, all journalism schools are starting to think about it. And I know that our digital journalism program, which I hope takes off in Guadalajara, will be precisely that type of thing. You'll be able to take a 6-week module in X, in quality investigative reporting or in digital reporting or whatever it is. So, but if you would like to link up with the journalist, I think we can help you do that too. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Your talk seems to have focused mostly on, I guess, what I would call change from within and source material kinds of things. And it seems to me that very few news organizations today spend much time reporting on the news of news itself, covering the process of news and what news readers or consumers or whatever should be looking for as signs of good quality journalism. And I wonder what you're doing about that, what we should be doing about that, things like that.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this program at SUNY Stony Brook, where they're trying to educate news consumers about how to consume the news. I don't think that newspapers necessarily see themselves or TV stations as purveyors of teaching what is quality journalism. Journalism schools do that, and I think that consumers aren't going to journalism. Well, that's what we're seeing, a crop of all new types of programs, come up now to try to educate people on what is quality news. When we deal mostly with international journalists, and they're up against hurdles that are phenomenally difficult. It could be that you heard the description of some of just what it takes just to go to work and how life-threatening this can be. We deal with issue. We just had a program for Latin American journalists on how to establish an ethical newsroom. And how do you establish an ethical newsroom when you don't have necessarily any kind of infrastructure for that? How do you go about building a consensus to get that in the newsroom? How do you get the editors to buy in? How do you get the business side to stay away? All the kind of things that are really crucial. And we have some tools for doing that with international journalists. But I think it's a good question because I think that there's a lot of confusion as to what is quality journalism now. That said, I have two kids who are college age, and they have dealt with information on the net from the very beginning, and I actually think that their filter for garbage is pretty high. That I think that, interestingly enough, that they seem to understand that this is just not worth paying attention to, and this is. And when I see that, my son has CNN as a homepage, without me telling him to go to CNN, I think that that's encouraging in a way because he's using reliable news sources. Yeah.
So moving beyond reputation, if we had all of the time in the world to develop new technology, how can we? What tools do you think would help enable both better quality journalism and better understanding and comprehension of what's being output by the consumers? And just to give you two examples, maybe to go off of, what about a better system for providing references and doing automatic fact-checking? Or what about a better user interface for showing dissenting views on some opinion?
Yeah, those are all good ideas. I mean, I think that they're all sort of basics in terms of, journalism training. Check your facts, make sure your information is accurate. Go back, make sure if you have to that a quote is in context. Don't pull it out. Don't use parts of it. But what kind of metrics could you use? I mean, one of the things is sometimes I'll do a search just on Google to find something, and what pops up, of course, is the most widely read story. When I check myself out on the web, oftentimes the first story after 25, 30 years in journalism is a story about my son who happens to be an excellent poker player, and I'm quoted in that story about his poker playing prowess. And so, okay, interesting statement about me, but not exactly about the type of journalism that I do. So I wonder if there are ways where you can have search for quantity, whether you can have built-in ways of searching for quality. And how you would do that, I mean, would be worth a much bigger discussion. And I think that would be an enormous service to readers, an enormous service. So you can pick the type of search that you would like to get. And if it's for news, that's what I want. I want quality. I need to trust what you're telling me, because I'm making decisions on this. It's shaping my life. It's potentially affecting it or improving my life, and I need to know that this is not just garbage.
We have time for one more question, but we're going to lunch afterwards, and there's also some time on Joyce's schedule afterwards. So find me after we're done if you want to join us for lunch, or if you want to get on Joyce's schedule. I think our last question.
Yeah. Thank you for coming, by the way. So you've mentioned probably 3 different new sorts of journalists or quasi-journalists, digital journalists. Citizen journalists who I guess happen to be in the right place at the right time and then write up something. Bloggers who I think maybe you're delineating journalists versus bloggers as whether they're just op-ed mouthpieces. Versus actually trying to do real journalism. And then that last category is sort of the new digital journalists, where they're freelance journalists, but they're not necessarily attached to any organization. And that particular group of people seems like they're working very hard to put quality journalism out. And how much are they promoting themselves and the work that they do? Because obviously you have to find them, and they have to make themselves known. And for Google, I mean, it really helps if people advertise themselves, because search engines do well when things are linked well and people work hard to promote themselves. So I'm interested in how do you find these new journalists? Do they come to you, or do you just?
We have people training all over the world. So oftentimes, like when we solicit for our awards, we get thousands of people that get our email, and people write in and say, this is an excellent candidate here, this is an excellent candidate here. And we build kind of an understanding of who's doing groundbreaking stuff. We're now like on the cusp of sort of the digital revolution in the emerging markets. Now, clearly there are some countries in Asia that are on the cutting edge, but the vast majority are first getting their heads around it. And we're first starting to see who can do what. So we don't have a very, very, very long list. But what we want to do is make sure that we can get out there and provide the skills now and the knowledge of how to do it well and what doing it well really means, so that you guys can capture them and put them there. And I'd also like to think of that how I think we can be a very good broker with that whole universe of aspiring journalists out there, digital journalists, high-quality digital journalists. And, again, I mentioned in the speech, as we cut back in newsrooms overseas, I was overseas for 11 years as a correspondent. And, they knew what they were getting when they sent me overseas. They knew the type of reporting, and they knew what they can trust. And, you have to understand that there's this very, very high risk of if you hire somebody that you don't know and you get slapped with some lawsuit in some country where there isn't a First Amendment, you got a lot of problems on your hands. So it's a very, very dicey situation. So that's why, you had international you had journalists from your own organization go out, and then you can train other journalists who are local on the ground and have them come up through the ranks. But now that's disappearing, and now we're just trying to identify who can be really good sources for this type of stuff. But it isn't easy, and journalists don't normally go out there and self-promote. They let their work do it, and they let other people promote. They'll say, oh, look, this guy's doing great work in Pakistan. I want to hire him as my stringer. And I think by using and seeing who is hiring these people, what type of photojournalists are getting picked up by all the news agencies, what type of freelance journalists are being used by Bloomberg, this one, that one, if Bloomberg does indeed use freelancers, is worth monitoring, and that could be a quality control mechanism. Thank you.
I think we've run out of time. As I said, we're going to lunch. Thank you again, Joyce, for coming.
Thank you very much, and my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.